Welcome back, fellow dreamer, to another journey through realms both waking and dreaming. Tonight, we walk a path lit only by starlight and memory, tracing the footsteps of a people who came from beyond the sky itself. This is the story of the elves, the Aen Seidhe, the people of the hills, a story of silver ships and fading songs, of ancient forests and ruined palaces, of a glory that once was and can never be again. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us drift together through the long twilight of an elder race. Chapter 1. The silver ships upon distant waters. Long ago, before the world knew the sound of human voices, before the continent bore witness to kingdoms rising and falling like the tides, there came ships upon waters that no map could chart. They were white as winter moonlight, these vessels sailing not upon any earthly ocean, but through the spaces between worlds themselves. And in those ships rode beings of such beauty and strangeness that to behold them was to glimpse something beyond mortal understanding. These were the elves, though they did not yet call themselves by that name. In those ancient days, they were simply the Aen Seidhe, the first people, the original folk. They had fled their dying homeworld, a place whose name has been lost to time and silence, escaping through portals woven from starlight and ancient magic. Their world was ending, consumed by forces beyond even their considerable power to halt, and so they became wanderers across the infinite spheres of existence. The elves of that distant age were not as the elves who would later walk the forests of the continent. No, they were something else entirely, something more. They were ethereal beings, half dream and half reality, existing across multiple dimensions at once. Their bodies were beautiful beyond human comprehension, tall and graceful, with features that seemed carved from moonlight itself. But it was their minds, their consciousness, that truly set them apart. They could perceive reality in ways that would shatter a mortal's sanity, seeing the threads that connected all things, feeling the pulse of magic that flowed through the multiverse like blood through veins. These elves possessed a gift that made them masters of infinity itself. They could travel between worlds at will. No portal was needed, no magical construct or ancient artifact. They simply stepped from one sphere of existence to another as easily as we might walk from one room to the next. This ability was innate to their very being, woven into the fabric of their souls. They were children of the multiverse, and all of creation was their home. For ages uncounted, they wandered. They visited worlds beyond number, each one stranger than the last. Some worlds they merely observed, studying the strange forms of life that had evolved there. Others they settled for a time, building cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, structures of such beauty and complexity that they seemed more like dreams made solid than anything constructed by mortal hands. But wandering, however free, carries its own weight. The elves yearned for something more permanent, something that could be truly theirs. And so when their scouts discovered a new world, a place of vast forests and towering mountains, of deep oceans and wide plains untouched by their kind, they knew they had found what they sought. This world already had inhabitants, the gnomes and dwarves who had come before, but there was room enough for all. And so the silver ships set sail one final time, carrying the elves to their new home. They arrived on the southern shores of what would one day be called the continent, Approximately 2,500 years before humans would set foot upon those same beaches, the gnomes watched from their hidden places, curious and cautious. The dwarves, already established in their mountain strongholds, eyed these newcomers with suspicion. There were conflicts, inevitably. The dwarves had claimed the mountains as their own, and when the elves sought to establish settlements in those high places, war came. But the elves were mighty beyond measure in those days. Their magic was the magic of creation itself, drawn from their connection to the multiverse. They wielded powers that could reshape reality, that could bend time and space to their will. The dwarves fought bravely, but they fought against beings who had transcended the normal limitations of mortality. Eventually, a peace was made, uneasy but holding. The dwarves would keep their deep mountain halls, and the elves would build their palaces in the valleys and upon the hills. And build they did with a vision and artistry that the world had never seen before. Their cities rose like songs made solid, all silver towers and gossamer bridges, gardens that bloomed with flowers from a dozen different worlds, fountains whose waters flowed upward toward the stars. They built the twin towers, Tor Lara and Tor Ziriel, mighty constructs that served as anchors between dimensions, allowing even easier travel across the spheres. These towers stood as testament to Elven mastery over the very fabric of reality. In those early days, the elves named themselves the Aen Seidhe, the people of the hills, to distinguish themselves from those kin who had chosen different worlds. They spread across the land, claiming valleys and forests, riversides and coastal plains. They built Lokmuin, a place of learning and magic, where even the stones hummed with power. They raised palaces whose names have been lost, but whose ruins still whisper of past glory. And for a time, measured in centuries that passed like seasons to their long-lived eyes, all was well. The elves lived in harmony with the land, taking only what they needed, giving back in equal measure. Their scholars delved deep into the mysteries of magic and nature. Their artists created works of such profound beauty that to behold them was to weep. Their sages studied the stars and spoke with the ancient spirits of the world. They were at peace, and in their peace they flourished. But even in those golden days, there were whispers of change to come. The multiverse is vast and ever-shifting, and the connections between worlds are never permanent. The very ability that had brought the elves to this world, that gift of traveling between spheres, would one day be tested in ways they could never have imagined. Chapter 2. Before the Breaking. Children of Infinity. To understand the elves as they truly were, before loss and exile diminished them, we must look even further back to the days when they were still whole, still united as one people. The Aen Undud, they called themselves in those distant times, and they were beings of pure wonder. Their original homeworld, that place lost to memory and catastrophe, had been a realm of unimaginable beauty. It was a world where magic was not something to be studied or learned, but rather something that simply was, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as starlight. The very air shimmered with potential, and reality itself was more flexible, more responsive to will and desire. On that world, the elves had achieved a civilization that transcended anything the continent would ever know. They had no need for crude fortifications or defensive walls, for their mastery of magic made them invulnerable to any threat. They did not farm the land in the human sense, for they could simply call forth what they needed from the earth itself. They did not age as mortals age, did not sicken or suffer the frailties that plague lesser beings. Their cities were wonders beyond description, existing partially in the physical realm and partially in dimensions of pure thought and dream. A single elven palace might have rooms that occupied the same space, but existed in different moments of time, so that one could walk from dawn to dusk simply by passing through a doorway. Their gardens grew flowers that bloomed with colors that had no name in any mortal tongue, plants brought from 1,000 different worlds and coaxed to thrive together in impossible harmony. The elves of that age were not merely long-lived, they were functionally immortal. Death came to them only through violence or the most profound of magical accidents. They watched stars be born and die, measured time in the rise and fall of mountain ranges. A single elf might accumulate knowledge across thousands of years, becoming a repository of wisdom and experience that would dwarf any human library. But their greatest gift, the ability that defined them more than any other, was their connection to the multiverse itself. Every elf possessed, to a greater or lesser degree, the power to traverse the boundaries between worlds. It was an innate ability, something they were born with, as natural to them as flight is to birds. They did not need portals or gateways, though they could create such things for convenience or to allow lesser beings to travel with them. They simply willed themselves from one sphere of existence to another, and it was done. This gift meant that no single world could contain them. They spread across the multiverse like seeds on cosmic winds, exploring, discovering, building temporary homes on countless worlds. Some elves spent centuries wandering, never staying in one place for more than a few years. Others became collectors of sorts, gathering knowledge and artifacts from 1,000 different realities, building vast libraries that existed in pocket dimensions, accessible from anywhere and nowhere. But this gift came with a price, though they did not recognize it as such at the time. Their connection to the multiverse, their ability to exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously, began to change them. They became less solid, less grounded in any single reality. They were magnificent, yes, but they were also becoming something abstract, something that existed more in the realm of pure concept than the physical being. And then came the catastrophe. The nature of the disaster that destroyed their homeworld remains shrouded in mystery. Some legends speak of a cosmic ice, a freezing doom that spread across the world like a cancer, killing everything it touched. Others whisper of war, of elven factions turning on one another with such ferocity that they rent the very fabric of their world asunder. Still others claim it was simply the natural end of things, that their world had grown old and tired and ready to pass into the darkness. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The elves were forced to flee, to abandon the world that had been their home since time immemorial. And in their flight, in their desperate search for new homes across the infinite spheres, they made a choice that would shape all their future history. They split, not all at once, not in a single moment of division, but gradually, as different groups of elves found different worlds that called to them. Some found a world already inhabited by a race of unicorns, beings who possessed their own connection to the multiverse. These elves would become the Aen Seidhe, the people of the Alders, and their history would be marked by endless conflict, with those unicorns whose abilities they both envied and feared. Others found the world that contained the continent, a place already inhabited by gnomes and dwarves, but rich in untapped magic and natural beauty. These would become the Aen Seidhe, the people of the hills, and their story would be one of glory and golden ages followed by inexorable decline. The split was not hostile, not at first. The elves still saw themselves as one people, simply distributed across different worlds. They maintained contact through their gift of multiverse travel, visiting one another, sharing knowledge and art. But slowly, gradually, they began to drift apart. The Aen El, locked in their war with the unicorns, became harder, more militaristic. The Aen Seidhe, at peace in their new home, became gentler, more focused on art and scholarship, and all the while, unnoticed by either group, something was changing. The multiverse itself was shifting, preparing for an event that would reshape reality across countless spheres of existence. The connections between worlds were growing stronger, more volatile. The boundaries that separated one dimension from another were wearing thin. The conjunction of the spheres was coming, though no one yet knew what it would mean. Chapter 3: The Golden Age, when elves ruled all. For 2,000 years, the Aen Seidhe dwelled upon the continent in peace and prosperity. 2,000 years of building and creating, of exploring and discovering, of living in harmony with the land they had claimed as their own. It was an age of such glory that even now, long after its ending, the memory of it haunts the ruins of Elven civilization like a ghost that will not rest. Their cities were jewels scattered across the landscape, each one unique, each one a masterpiece of architecture and magic, where humans would later build crude stone fortresses and squat timber halls. The elves raised structures of such delicate beauty that they seemed ready to dissolve into morning mist at any moment. Yet they were stronger than any human castle, protected by magic woven into their very foundations by spells that had been cast when the world was young. The capital, whose name has been lost to time, stood on a hill overlooking a valley of eternal flowers. Its towers were wrought from crystal that sang in the wind, and its bridges spanned distances that should have been impossible, held aloft by nothing but enchantment and elvish will. In the great hall of that city, the High King of the Aen Seidhe held court, though his rule was more guidance than domination. The elves had little need for strict hierarchy. Each was wise enough to govern themselves, and disputes were rare enough that formal laws were unnecessary. Throughout the continent, other elven settlements flourished. Loch Muin stood as a centre of magical learning, a place where the secrets of reality itself were studied and taught. Young elves, though young, meant something different to them. Those in their first century of life came from across the land to learn from the sages. Here they were taught to read the stars, to speak with spirits, to weave spells of incredible complexity and power. Here too, in an act of unprecedented generosity, they would later teach magic to human children, hoping to bridge the gap between their peoples. Sharawed, the Palace of the Ice, rose in the far north, a place of cold beauty where the elves studied the magic of winter and frost. Its halls were carved from ice that never melted, and its windows looked out upon frozen wastes that the elves found lovely beyond measure. They would host great festivals there, celebrations that lasted for weeks, where elven lords and, ladies from across the continent would gather to dance and sing and feast beneath the aurora that painted the northern sky. Dol Blythana, the Valley of Flowers, was perhaps the most beloved of all elven lands. Here the climate was mild and the earth rich, and flowers bloomed in such profusion that the very air was heavy with their perfume. The elves built no grand palaces in Dol Blythana. Instead, they lived in harmony with nature, their homes woven from living trees and flowering vines. They tended great gardens where plants from across the multiverse grew side by side, creating combinations of color and form that existed nowhere else. Even the places that would later become human cities bore witness to elven glory. The site where Sintra would one day stand had been an elven settlement of great beauty. Sidaris, that wealthy port, was built atop the foundations of an elven coastal city. Oxenford, Novigrad, dozens of other human settlements were constructed over the bones of elven civilization, humans living among ruins they could not begin to understand or replicate. The elves did not merely build, however. They created. Their poets composed verses of such beauty that to hear them was to weep. Even if you could not understand the words, their musicians played instruments that do not exist in the world anymore, creating melodies that seem to echo across dimensions. Their painters captured scenes not just as they appeared to the eye, but as they felt to the soul, so that to look upon their art was to experience the emotion the artist had felt when creating it. Their scholars pushed the boundaries of knowledge in every direction. They mapped the stars with incredible precision, charting not just their positions, but their movements across vast stretches of time, predicting eclipses and conjunctions decades in advance. They studied the natural world with loving attention, learning the names and properties of every plant and animal, understanding ecosystems as complex webs of interconnection. They delved into mathematics and discovered truths about the nature of reality that humans would not rediscover for centuries, if at all. And always, they practiced magic. The elves were not the first to use magic on the continent. The gnomes and dwarves had their own mystical traditions. But elven magic was something else entirely. It was more refined, more powerful, more versatile. Where dwarven runecraft was solid and practical, elven magic was flowing and artistic. Where gnomish alchemy was careful and measured, elven enchantment was intuitive and bold. The Aen Seidhe, the Knowing Ones, stood at the pinnacle of elven magical achievement. These sages had devoted centuries to understanding the deepest mysteries of existence. They could see across vast distances, perceive events before they happened, speak with beings from other dimensions. They were honored above all others in elven society, for knowledge was the highest virtue the Aen Seidhe recognized. It was the Aen Seidhe who built the three great towers: Tor Lara, the Tower of the Gulls, which stood upon the Isle of Thanedd; Tor Ziriel, the Tower of the Swallow, whose location has been lost to history; and Tor Gvalchka, the Tower of the She-Falcon, which rose upon the frozen heights of Undvik in Skellige. These towers were more than mere buildings. They were anchors, points where the boundaries between worlds were permanently thinned, where an elf with sufficient power could step from the continent to other spheres with ease. The towers served another purpose as well. They were warnings, watchtowers in the truest sense, devices that allowed the elves to monitor the connections between worlds. Through them, The Aen Seidhe could feel the pulse of the multiverse, could sense disturbances in the fabric of reality. They stood as testament to Elven mastery over the very structure of existence, and the elves needed no walls, no fortifications, for who would dare attack them? The dwarves had long since retreated to their mountains, content to leave the valleys and plains to Elven dominion. The gnomes kept to their hidden places, peaceful and reclusive. There were monsters, certainly, creatures of fang and claw and venom, but these posed little threat to beings who could unmake them with a thought. The elves lived long lives, 300 to 400 years on average, though some few lived even longer. They aged slowly, remaining young and vital for centuries before the weight of years finally began to show. But their longevity came with a cost that they did not yet recognize. Only the young could conceive children, those in their first century of life, and even then, fertility was uncertain. Many elven couples would never bear a child, no matter how desperately they wished for one. This did not trouble them overmuch in the Golden Age. They lived so long that there was always time, always another chance. And their population, while it did not grow rapidly, was stable. They had everything they needed: peace, prosperity, purpose. They were, in every way that mattered, masters of all they surveyed. They did not know that their golden age was approaching its end. They did not know that the towers they had built to monitor the multiverse would soon register disturbances of unprecedented magnitude. They did not know that other beings, desperate and violent, were preparing to cross between worlds in vast numbers. The elves lived in their paradise, unaware that the conjunction of the spheres was almost upon them, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 4. The Conjunction. When Worlds Collided. 1,500 years before the time of Geralt of Rivia, reality itself convulsed. The boundaries between worlds, those invisible walls that kept one sphere of existence separate from another, suddenly and catastrophically collapsed. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of different universes slammed together in our cosmic cataclysm that would come to be known as the conjunction of the spheres. No one knows what caused it. The Elven sages, for all their wisdom and foresight, had seen signs of growing instability in the multiverse, but nothing that could have prepared them for what was to come. Some scholars would later theorize that it was a natural disaster, a cosmic alignment that happens once in countless eons. Others whispered that it was caused deliberately, that some foolish mage or malevolent deity had tampered with forces beyond their comprehension. The truth has been lost to time, if indeed anyone ever knew it. What is known is the result. For a brief period, measured in days or perhaps weeks, the normal rules of reality simply ceased to apply. Portals opened everywhere, vast rifts in space and time through which creatures from countless worlds came pouring into the continent. The sky itself seemed to tear open, revealing glimpses of other places, other realities. Stars appeared and vanished. The sun rose in the west and set in the east. Time flowed backward and forward simultaneously. It was chaos in its purest form, the ordered universe reduced to madness. Through these portals came things the continent had never seen before. Monsters beyond counting, creatures of nightmare and horror, ghouls that fed on corpses, their bodies twisted and wrong, gravers that lurked in graveyards, drawn to death like moths to flame, vampires of a dozen different varieties, some intelligent and cultured, others nothing more than mindless killing machines. Basilisks whose gaze could turn flesh to stone. Fiends with minds like mazes and claws like scythes, and so many more. A menagerie of horror that would plague the continent for centuries to come. But it was not only monsters that came through the conjunction. There were other beings as well, displaced from their homes and thrust into a world they did not understand. Halflings found themselves on the continent, far from whatever peaceful land they had originally inhabited. The Vran, a reptilian race of great intelligence, arrived in small numbers. Werbubs, whose nature remains mysterious even now, slipped into the world unnoticed. And humans came. Not the civilized kingdoms that would later dominate the continent, but their ancestors, the Dauk and Wasgor peoples. These were humans in their most primitive state, barbarians fleeing a dying world, arriving with nothing but what they could carry and a desperate will to survive. They had destroyed their own world, according to Elven accounts, and now they sought to claim a new one. For the elves, the conjunction was a catastrophe beyond measure. They had been prepared for many things, but not for reality itself to break down around them. Their careful civilization, built over 2,000 years, was suddenly under assault from forces they could barely comprehend. Monsters poured through rifts in space, attacking elven settlements without warning or mercy. The towers, those anchors meant to stabilize the connections between worlds, became conduits for uncontrolled dimensional energy. And something else happened during the conjunction, something that would prove even more devastating in the long term. The elves' power began to fade. The gift that had defined them, that ability to traverse the multiverse at will, started to slip away. They could feel it happening, feel their connection to other worlds growing weaker, more tenuous. The conjunction was not just bringing new creatures to the continent, it was fundamentally changing the nature of magic itself. Before the conjunction, magic had been a subtle thing, a force that flowed naturally through the world, that could be shaped and directed by those with the knowledge and will to do so. After the conjunction, a new kind of magic emerged, something raw, more primal. This was magic born from chaos, from the collision of multiple realities. And it was more powerful but also more dangerous than what had come before. The elves adapted as best they could. They fought back against the monsters, using their still formidable magic to defend their cities and people. They built wards and barriers, trying to protect themselves from the worst of the incursions. Their warriors, who had known little combat before, learned quickly how to battle creatures of nightmare. Their mages developed new spells, new ways of channeling the changed magic that now suffused the world. But they were fighting a losing battle, and they knew it. For every monster they slew, 10 more came through the portals. For every ward they raised, some new horror found a way around it. And all the while, their power continued to diminish, their connection to the multiverse continuing to fray. When the conjunction finally ended, when the portals closed and reality reasserted itself, the elves found themselves in a world transformed. The monsters that had come through were now permanent residents, trapped on the continent, just as surely as the elves themselves. The humans who had arrived were beginning to spread out, to establish their own settlements, to claim land the elves had thought permanently theirs. and the elves themselves were changed. They could no longer travel freely between worlds. That gift was gone, severed by the conjunction. They were trapped on the continent, cut off from their kin, the Aen Seidhe, who dwelt in another sphere entirely. They could still use magic, certainly, but it was harder now, less intuitive. They had to study and practice where once it had come naturally. They were still long-lived, still beautiful, still possessed of knowledge and culture far beyond what the humans could claim. But they were no longer the beings they had been. The conjunction had diminished them, had stolen something essential from their very nature. They were becoming more solid, more fixed in a single reality. They were, in short, becoming mortal. Not in the sense of being short-lived. They would still measure their years in centuries, but mortal in the sense of being bound to a single world, a single timeline, a single reality. The elves did not yet understand the full implications of what had happened. They could not know that they had been set upon an inexorable path of decline. They could not foresee that the humans who had arrived through the conjunction, those primitive barbarians, would one day conquer everything the elves had built. They could not imagine that their golden age had truly ended, never to return. For now, they simply tried to rebuild, to restore what had been damaged, to protect what remained. They hoped that, in time, things would return to normal. They believed that their civilization was strong enough to weather any storm. They were wrong. Chapter 5. The Fading, when power became memory. In the centuries following the conjunction, the Aen Seidhe found themselves facing a mystery that all their wisdom could not explain. They were changing, devolving in ways both subtle and profound. The magnificent beings who had crossed between worlds like gods were becoming something lesser, something more limited. It was a slow death, a gradual diminishment that crept upon them so gently that at first they did not even notice. Their connection to the multiverse, that ability to traverse dimensions that had once been as natural as breathing, was simply gone. The portals between worlds still existed, the towers still stood, but the innate power to walk between spheres had been severed. An elf could no longer simply will themselves to another world. They needed artifacts, rituals, immense concentrations of magical power. What had once been effortless now required the combined efforts of multiple Aen Seidhe. And even then, success was uncertain. This loss went deeper than mere travel, however. The elves' entire relationship with magic was changing. Where once they had been able to perceive the flows of magical energy with perfect clarity, could sense the web of power that connected all things. Now their perception was clouded, limited. They were becoming blind to dimensions of reality they had once navigated with ease. Their physical forms were changing too. They remained beautiful by any standard, tall and graceful with features that humans would consider perfect. But they were becoming more solid, more fixed in three-dimensional space. They could no longer exist partially in other dimensions, could no longer shift their forms with thought. They were being locked into physical reality in ways they had never been before. Most troublingly of all, they found that their children, when they could have children at all, were born weaker than their parents. Each generation possessed less power than the one before. An elf born immediately after the conjunction might still have a shadow of their ancestors' gifts, might be able to sense other dimensions even if they could not reach them. but their children would have even less, and their children's children less still. The Aen Seidhe debated endlessly about the cause of this decline. Some believed it was connected to the conjunction itself, that the cosmic cataclysm had fundamentally altered the nature of elven existence. They theorized that the elves' power had come from their connection to multiple spheres, and that being trapped in a single world had severed that connection. As the spheres separated after the conjunction, moving further and further apart, the elves became weaker and weaker. Others thought the problem was more subtle. They observed that the elves were not the only race on the continent with innate magical abilities. The unicorns in distant lands possessed similar gifts, but the unicorns were native to a single world, had never been multiverse travelers, and their powers remained constant. What if, these sages wondered, the elves' problem was that they were adapted to exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously? By being forced to exist in only one, they were like fish pulled from water, slowly suffocating in an environment they were never meant to permanently inhabit. A third theory, darker and more disturbing, suggested that the elves were paying the price for their own transcendence. They had become so powerful, so divorced from physical reality, that they had essentially made themselves obsolete. Evolution, or perhaps the universe itself, was correcting this imbalance by bringing them back down, making them more like the other races that inhabited physical worlds. From this perspective, the devolution was not a curse, but a natural process. The elves learning to be truly alive again rather than half-phantom beings. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. The Aen Seidhe were becoming, generation by generation, more similar to humans. They were still longer lived, still capable of magic, still possessed of wisdom and culture beyond what humans could achieve. But the gap was closing. Where once the difference between an elf and a human was like the difference between a god and a mortal, now it was more like the difference between a master and a student, significant but no longer insurmountable. And there was another problem, one that would prove even more critical in the long term. The elves' already low fertility rates were becoming even worse. Only young elves, those in their first century, could conceive children, and even then the chances of success were slim. Perhaps one couple in 3 would manage to bear a child, and many elves went through their entire lives without ever having offspring. This would not have been a crisis if the elves had still lived in peace, if they had centuries to slowly rebuild their population. But they did not have peace. The humans who had arrived during the conjunction were multiplying rapidly. Where an elven couple might have 1 child in a century, a human couple could have half a dozen in a decade. The humans bred like rabbits, as the dwarves crudely observed, and their population was exploding. At first, the elves tried to be generous. These humans were displaced, traumatized by the loss of their world and their violent arrival on the continent. The elves took pity on them. They taught some humans magic, bringing children to Loch Muin to study alongside young elves. They shared knowledge of agriculture, of medicine, of the arts. They hoped that by helping humanity, they could ensure peaceful coexistence. It was a mistake born of elven kindness and elven arrogance. They could not imagine that these primitive beings could ever pose a real threat. The humans were so short-lived, gone in the blink of an elven eye. They were violent and crude, lacking in culture and refinement. Surely they could never challenge a civilization as ancient and advanced as that of the Aen Seidhe. But the humans were adaptable in ways the elves were not. They learned quickly, eagerly absorbing the knowledge the elves shared, and then building upon it in their own ways. They learned to harness the new chaos magic that had emerged from the conjunction, becoming sorcerers and sorceresses of considerable power. And they multiplied, spreading across the continent like water seeping into every crack and crevice. Within a few generations, the initial small groups of humans had become numerous enough to be noticed. Within a few more, they were establishing their own kingdoms, carving out territories from land the elves had considered theirs. And they were not asking permission. They were taking what they wanted, and if the elves resisted, the humans fought. The first major conflict came in the 760s, when human warlords landed on the coast where an elven settlement had stood for centuries. The elves, seeing the humans' numbers and unwilling to wage a war that would accomplish nothing, chose to retreat. It was a pragmatic decision, they thought. Why spill blood over a single settlement when there was so much land? But the humans did not stop with one settlement. They pushed inland, claiming more territory. And when the elves tried to hold the line, tried to say that this far and no further, they discovered a terrible truth. In battle, the humans had an advantage the elves could never match. For every elf that fell, 5 humans stood ready to take their place. The elves could still defeat humans in individual combat, certainly. An elven warrior with centuries of training was more than a match for any human soldier. An elven mage could wield power that human sorcerers could only dream of. But numbers matter in war, and the humans had numbers beyond counting. They threw themselves at elven defenses in waves, and if the first wave was destroyed, a second came behind it, and a third, and a fourth, and every elf that died was irreplaceable. With their failing fertility, every loss was permanent, a wound to the race that could never truly heal. The humans could lose 10,000 soldiers and replenish their armies within a generation. The elves could lose 100 and spend a century trying to replace them, likely without success. So the elves retreated. Step by step, year by year, they gave ground. They abandoned settlements they had held for millennia. They watched as humans moved into their cities, turning palaces into fortresses, gardens into farmland, temples into churches of strange new gods. The elves took what they could carry, their most precious artifacts and books, and moved deeper into the forests, higher into the mountains, further from human expansion. But there was nowhere far enough. The humans were relentless in their spread, driven by a hunger for land and resources that the elves could not understand. And so the long retreat continued, a slow-motion tragedy that would play out across centuries. The once mighty Aen Seidhe reduced to refugees in a land that had been theirs since time immemorial. Chapter 6. Lara, Doran, the bridge between worlds. In the face of their inexorable decline, the elven sages searched desperately for a solution. Their people were fading, both in power and in numbers. The humans were multiplying, while the elves dwindled. Something had to be done. Some way had to be found to reverse the devolution that was destroying everything they had once been. It was the Aen Seidhe who conceived of the most audacious plan. If they could not regain their power through natural means, they would engineer it back into existence. They would take the gift that had been stolen from them, and, through careful breeding and magical manipulation, recreated in a new form. They called this genetic experiment Aen Seidhe, the Elder Blood, and they believed it could save their race. The theory was sound in its way. The elves' original power had come from their connection to the multiverse, their ability to exist across multiple dimensions. That gift was gone, severed by the conjunction. But what if they could breed a new ability, one specifically adapted to the changed reality of the post-conjunction world? What if they could create elves who possessed not the old power of effortless multiverse travel, but a new power, the ability to control time and space itself? The Aen Seidhe studied genetics with obsessive dedication, mapping bloodlines across generations, tracking the inheritance of magical ability. They identified certain families whose members showed unusual gifts, traces of something that might be shaped into what they needed. They encouraged marriages between these lines, subtle arrangements that would concentrate and magnify specific traits. But it was slow work, painfully slow. Elven generations passed at a crawl compared to human generations, and each pairing might produce only one child, if any at all. The sages needed centuries to see the results of their careful breeding, and they did not have centuries. The humans were at their doorstep, their armies growing stronger with each passing year, and so they made a desperate decision, one that would echo through the ages and shape the fate of nations yet unborn. They would introduce human blood into the elder bloodline. The idea was heresy to many elves, who viewed humans as little better than animals. But the Aen Seidhe saw something the others did not. Humans bred rapidly and possessed an adaptability that elves lacked. If the elder blood could be introduced into human lines, it might spread far more quickly than it ever could among the slowly reproducing elves. The key to this plan was Lara Dorren, an elven sorceress of exceptional power and beauty, a descendant of one of the carefully cultivated elder bloodlines. The sages approached her with their proposal. She would take a human lover, bear a half-elven child, who would carry the elder blood into human bloodlines. It was for the good of the race, they told her. It was the only hope of salvation. Whether Lara agreed out of duty or something else, no one can say for certain. But she did agree, and the sages found her a suitable partner, Cregennan of Lod, a human mage of considerable power and, by human standards, noble character. The pairing was arranged, carefully orchestrated to ensure that the elder blood would take root in human lineage. But something happened that the sages had not anticipated, something that their centuries of study and calculation had not prepared them for. Lara Dorren fell in love, not the arranged affection of a duty match, but true, passionate, all-consuming love. And Cregennan loved her in return with all the fierce intensity that humans bring to everything they do. Their love was scandalous, shocking both elven and human society. Elves who saw Lara with Cregennan viewed it as a betrayal of her race, a beautiful, high-born lady debasing herself with a human. Humans saw it as unnatural, the mixing of species that should remain separate. But Lara and Cregennan cared nothing for what others thought. They married in secret, bound themselves to one another with oaths that transcended the prejudices of their peoples. And Lara became pregnant, carrying within her the child that would be the bridge between two races, the first human to bear the elder blood in full measure. It should have been a moment of triumph for the Aen Seidhe, proof that their plan could work. Instead, it became a tragedy that would haunt both races for generations. The details of what happened next are lost to history, buried under centuries of pain and recrimination. But the broad strokes are known. Lara and Cregennan fled, seeking safety from those who would harm them for their transgression. They were pursued, hunted by those who could not bear to see elf and human united in love. In the dead of winter, with Lara heavy with child, they were cornered in the mountains. Cregennan died defending his wife and unborn child. He fought with all the power at his command, with all the desperate strength of a man protecting what he loves most. But he was one mage against many, and in the end he fell, his blood staining the snow red. Lara, heartbroken and wounded, fled into the winter wastes. Alone, suffering, she somehow managed to bring her child into the world before the cold claimed her. The baby, a daughter, was found alive beside her mother's frozen corpse by a human named Chero. He took the infant and raised her as his own, naming her Rhiannon. Thus did the elder blood enter human lineage, born not from cold calculation, but from the warmth of love and the agony of loss. Rhiannon grew to adulthood knowing nothing of her true heritage, believing herself fully human. She married and had children of her own, and through her descendants, the elder blood spread into human royal houses, flowing through the veins of kings and queens who had no idea what power they carried. But Lara's story did not end with her death in the snow. The Elven sages, horrified by what had happened, by the loss of such a precious bloodline and the death of its carrier, performed a ritual of unprecedented power. They bound Lara's spirit to the place where she had died, trapping her there in a form of immortality that was more curse than blessing. She became a wraith, a ghost condemned to wander the mountains forever, mourning her lost love and the child she would never see grow up. And in their grief and guilt, in their recognition that their careful plans had led to such terrible tragedy, the sages made a prophecy. Through one of their number, a young woman named Ithlin, they spoke of what the elder blood would become, of the power it would unleash upon the world. The prophecy spoke of Aen Seidhe, the swallow, the child of the elder blood who would one day have the power to save or destroy the world. The prophecy spoke of blood and fire, of a child who would be born of the elder blood and possess abilities beyond anything seen since the days before the conjunction. This child would have the power to open gates between worlds, to traverse time and space, to reshape reality itself. The swallow would come in a time of great need when the world stood on the edge of destruction, and their choices would determine the fate of all existence. But the prophecy was vague, as prophecies always are. It did not say when the swallow would come, or who they would be, or what choices they would make. It spoke only of potential, of power waiting to be unleashed, of destiny unfolding according to patterns too complex for mortal minds to fully comprehend. The Aen Seidhe received the prophecy with mixed feelings. On one hand, it suggested that their plan had worked, that the elder blood would produce exactly the kind of power they had hoped for. On the other hand, it had come at such terrible cost, and the prophecy made clear that the power of the elder blood would be dangerous, potentially catastrophic, if not properly controlled. And there was another problem. The elder blood was now in human hands, flowing through human veins. The elves had no control over it anymore, no way to guide its development or ensure it would be used for their benefit. They had created a weapon they could not wield, a power they had given to their enemies. In the years that followed, as the wars between elves and humans intensified, as more and more elven blood was spilled for land the humans claimed, many elves came to see Lara's story as the ultimate symbol of their race's tragedy. Here was an elf of power and nobility who had sacrificed everything, who had loved beyond the boundaries of her people, and what had it gained them? A prophecy of destruction and a bloodline they could not control. But there were others, fewer in number, but no less passionate, who saw Lara's story differently. They saw in her choice to love a human, to bridge the divide between their peoples, a hope that perhaps elves and humans need not be enemies. Perhaps, they whispered in the darkness of exiled camps, perhaps if more had followed Lara's example, if more had chosen love over prejudice, the tragedy that was unfolding might have been averted. These elves kept Lara's memory alive, not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration. They told her story to their children, speaking of her courage, her passion, her refusal to let the hatred of others dictate whom she could love. And in distant years, when her descendant would finally emerge, when the child of the elder blood would walk the world and reshape its destiny, some would remember Lara Dorren and see in her the beginning of everything. Chapter 7. The Wars. When forests burned. The human expansion that had begun as a trickle in the centuries after the conjunction became a flood. By the year 1000, measured by the human calendar, they had established kingdoms across much of the continent. Temeria, Redania, Aden, Cadwyn. These names meant nothing to the elves when they first heard them, merely the latest in an endless succession of human tribal confederations. But these kingdoms were different, more organized, more permanent than anything that had come before. The humans had learned much from the elves, perhaps too much. They had taken elven knowledge of magic and made it their own, training their own sorcerers who could rival even the Aen Seidhe in power, if not in wisdom. They had studied elven architecture and adapted it to their own purposes, building castles that combined elven beauty with human functionality. They had absorbed elven culture, translating elven poetry and music into human tongues, though something essential was always lost in the translation. And having learned all they could, having taken everything the elves had offered and more besides, the humans wanted what remained. They wanted the ancient forests where the last great elven cities still stood. They wanted Dol Blathana, that valley of eternal flowers. They wanted every last piece of land the elves still held, and they were willing to take it by force. The wars that followed were not sudden explosions of violence, but rather a long, grinding campaign of expansion and extermination that spanned generations. The humans did not always attack with armies. Sometimes they simply moved into elven lands in large numbers, establishing farms and villages until the elves were outnumbered in their own territories. When the elves protested, the humans claimed ancient rights, produced forged deeds, or simply shrugged and dared the elves to do something about it. When the elves did fight back, when they gathered their remaining warriors and struck at human settlements, they won battles but lost the war. A successful elven raid might kill hundreds of humans, burn dozens of farms, but within a few years the humans would return, rebuilding what had been destroyed. And the elves who had won that battle, perhaps 100 warriors, represented an irreplaceable loss to a population that could not sustain such casualties. The human kings began to see the elves as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be negotiated with. They offered bounties for elven ears, turning the hunting of sentient beings into a sport for ambitious young humans seeking fortune. They pushed the elves further and further into marginal lands, into deep forests and high mountains, where even determined humans might not follow. The great elven cities fell one by one. Loch Muin, that center of magical learning, was sacked and burned. The libraries that held 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge went up in flames, and the human soldiers who set those fires could not even read the books they destroyed. Sheroed, the Palace of the Ice, was besieged and finally taken after a desperate last stand by its defenders. The humans found the frozen palace too strange for their tastes and abandoned it, leaving it to gradually collapse into ruin. Settlement after settlement was overrun. The humans were not always cruel in their conquest. Sometimes they simply moved in after the elves had fled, occupying empty cities without a fight. But whether through violence or simple demographic pressure, the result was the same. The Aen Seidhe were being pushed out of every place they had called home. Some elves tried to make peace with the humans, to negotiate coexistence. They offered to share the land, to teach the humans even more of their knowledge, to intermarry and create a blended culture. A few human leaders accepted these offers, but they were the exception. Most humans saw the elves as a dying race, a remnant of the past that needed to be swept aside so that humanity could claim its destiny as the dominant species on the continent. And the elves were divided among themselves. Some advocated fighting to the last, dying with weapons in hand rather than submitting to human domination. Others counseled retreat, preservation of what little remained of their culture, even if it meant abandoning their ancestral lands. Still others argued for accommodation, for accepting human rule in exchange for the right to survive, even if only as a subject people. The most radical faction among the elves took a name that would become infamous in human lands: the Scoia'tael, the Squirrels. The name was originally given to them by humans, a mocking reference to their habit of living in forests and trees like animals. But the elven guerrilla fighters embraced the insult, wearing it as a badge of pride. If the humans saw them as animals, they would show the humans what cornered animals could do. The Scoia'tael waged a campaign of terror against human settlers and soldiers. They ambushed convoys, attacked isolated farms, assassinated human officials who had been particularly brutal in their treatment of elves. They struck from the forests like ghosts, appearing out of nowhere, killing swiftly and vanishing before organized resistance could form. They became the stuff of human nightmares, the monsters lurking in the deep woods waiting to murder unwary travelers. But for every human the Scoia'tael killed, 10 elves died in reprisals. The human kings used the guerrilla attacks as justification for increasingly harsh measures against all elves, not just the fighters. Elven communities that had tried to remain neutral were burned out on suspicion of harboring Scoia'tael. Elves living in human cities were subjected to discrimination and violence, driven into ghettos where they could be easily watched and controlled. A few human voices spoke against these atrocities. Some sorcerers and sorceresses mindful of the debt humanity owed to Elven magical teaching, argued for mercy. Some merchants, pragmatic souls who saw elves as potential customers rather than enemies, advocated for peace. And a few nobles, educated in Elven literature and culture, mourned what was being lost. But they were a minority, and in times of war, minorities are rarely heard. By the year 1200, the elves had been pushed into the furthest reaches of the continent. Most lived in Dol Blathana, that valley which the humans had not yet managed to conquer, thanks to its remote location and the fierce defense mounted by its inhabitants. Others lived as refugees in human lands, hiding their heritage when possible, surviving on the margins of human society. Still others had joined the Scoia'tael, choosing to fight even though they knew the cause was hopeless. And through all these years of war and suffering, the elves remembered. They remembered the Golden Age, the cities of crystal and song. They remembered when they had been masters of the continent, when humans had been nothing but a curiosity. They remembered Lara Dorren and the prophecy of the Elder Blood. They remembered that they had once been immortal beings who could walk between worlds, and they wept for what they had lost. The humans tried to erase Elven history, tearing down monuments, burning books, forbidding the speaking of the Elven language in human territories. But memory is harder to kill than flesh, and the elves remembered. In secret places, in hidden valleys and deep forests, they taught their children the elder speech. They sang the old songs, though their voices grew fewer with each passing year. They kept alive the knowledge of who they had been, even if they could never return to that lost glory. And so the wars ground on, a slow genocide that the humans barely acknowledged, and the elves could do nothing to stop. The forest burned, and with them burned the last remnants of Elven civilization, smoke rising like prayers to gods who had long since ceased to listen. Chapter 8. The Scoia'tael. Songs of the Squirrels. In the deepest parts of the forests, where human axes had not yet reached, where the ancient trees still stood tall and the streams ran clear, the Scoia'tael made their camps. They were the last warriors of a dying race, guerrilla fighters who refused to surrender even when surrender was the only logical choice. They called themselves freedom fighters, and the humans called them terrorists. And perhaps both were right. The Scoia'tael were not a unified organization, but rather a collection of independent groups or commandos, each operating in their own territory. They ranged in size from a handful of fighters to groups of several dozen. Most were elves, but not all. A few dwarves and halflings, who had also suffered under human expansion, joined their ranks, and even occasionally a human who had been cast out from their own society for crimes or ideology. Their tactics were born of necessity. They could not face human armies in open battle. The numbers were simply too uneven. Instead, they used the forests as their weapon. They knew every path and game trail, every hidden dell and secret stream. They could move through the woods in absolute silence, while human soldiers crashed through the undergrowth like drunken bears. They struck without warning and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. A typical Scoia'tael attack might target a merchant caravan carrying goods to a newly established human settlement. The ambush would come from multiple directions simultaneously, arrows flying from concealment, cutting down guards before they could draw weapons. The commandos would take what they needed, food and weapons primarily, sometimes medical supplies, and leave the rest. If the merchants were wise, they surrendered immediately. The Scoia'tael rarely killed those who did not resist, but merchants guarded by armed escorts often tried to fight, and then the forest would run red with blood. The Scoia'tael also targeted isolated human settlements, particularly those built on lands that had recently been Elven territory. A farmstead that had been carved out of ancient forest, a logging camp destroying trees that had stood for 1,000 years. These were legitimate targets in the elves' view. They would strike at night, setting fires, killing or driving off the inhabitants, reclaiming the land for the forest. But their most important targets were symbolic: human officials who had been particularly brutal to elves, soldiers who had participated in massacres, bounty hunters who collected elven ears for gold. The Scoia'tael kept careful lists of such individuals, tracking them with patient dedication. And when the opportunity arose, these humans would simply disappear, found days or weeks later if they were found at all. Their bodies left in places calculated to send messages to others who might consider similar actions. The humans responded with increasingly brutal countermeasures. They established military outposts throughout forested regions, garrisoned with soldiers whose sole purpose was hunting the Scoia'tael. They hired skilled trackers, often dwarves who knew the forests almost as well as the elves did. They began cutting down entire sections of forest, destroying the Scoia'tael's cover and habitat along with it. And they made examples of anyone suspected of aiding the guerrillas. An elven village accused of providing food to the Scoia'tael might be burned to the ground, its inhabitants killed or driven into the wilderness. A human farmer who had traded with elves might find himself hanged as a collaborator. The message was clear. Association with the Scoia'tael meant death, and neutrality would not be tolerated. This reign of terror had an effect opposite to what the humans intended. Rather than isolating the Scoia'tael, it drove more elves into their ranks. What did peaceful accommodation gain them when humans could destroy them on mere suspicion? Better to die fighting, with a weapon in hand and blood on your blade, than to die passively, hoping that human mercy might spare you. The most famous of the Scoia'tael leaders was an elf named Iorveth, who commanded a commando operating along the borders of Aedirn. Iorveth had lost an eye in battle, and the scarring had left him with a fearsome appearance that the humans seized upon in their propaganda. They portrayed him as a monster, a bloodthirsty savage who killed for sport. In truth, Iorveth was a tactician of considerable skill, a leader who had kept his fighters alive and effective for years through careful planning and discipline. Iorveth's philosophy was pragmatic. He fought not because he believed the elves could win, but because surrender meant extinction. Every day the Scoia'tael continued to fight was another day the elves existed as a people, rather than as subjects or corpses. Every human who feared to enter the forests, every caravan that had to hire additional guards, every soldier pulled away from expansion to hunt guerrillas. These were small victories that added up to survival. But even Iorveth knew that survival was not victory. The elves needed something more than the ability to hide in forests and strike from ambush. They needed allies, territory they could call their own, some form of official recognition that would give them a place in the emerging political order of the continent. And so, when the opportunity arose, when human kingdoms went to war with each other and sought elven support, the Scoia'tael were willing to negotiate. The most significant of these opportunities came during the wars between Nilfgaard and the Northern Kingdoms. Nilfgaard, that vast southern empire, promised the elves everything they had been denied. The emperor himself, Emir var Emreis, sent emissaries to the Scoia'tael, offering them Dol Blathanna as an independent elven state if they would fight alongside Nilfgaardian forces against the Northern Kingdoms. It was a tempting offer, perhaps too tempting. Many Scoia'tael commandos joined Nilfgaard's armies, fighting as scouts and irregulars, using their forest skills to harass northern supply lines and assassinate key officials. They fought bravely and effectively, turning the tide of several important battles. They believed they were fighting for their people's future, for a homeland where elves could live free from human persecution. But Nilfgaard's promises proved hollow. When the war ended, the territory granted to the elves was a fraction of what had been offered. Dol Blathanna did receive a degree of autonomy, governed by Enid and Gleanna, an elven woman of royal blood, but she ruled as a vassal of Nilfgaard, not as an independent queen. The Scoia'tael, who had fought so hard, found themselves relegated to second-class status in the very homeland they had been promised. Worse, the peace treaties that ended the wars included provisions that the northern kingdoms would cease persecuting elves, provisions that were immediately and completely ignored. The killings continued, the discrimination continued, and the Scoia'tael, who had believed they were fighting for a better future, found that nothing had really changed. Some Scoia'tael accepted this outcome, laid down their weapons, and tried to make lives for themselves in the diminished Dol Blathanna or in human territories. Others, bitter and betrayed, retreated deeper into the forests, continuing their guerrilla war not because they believed it would achieve anything, but because fighting was all they had left. They became shadows in the deep woods, ghosts that haunted human nightmares, the last expression of elven pride and defiance. And in the taverns of human cities, bards sang songs about the Scoia'tael. Some of these songs portrayed them as murderous bandits, villains who had to be destroyed for civilization to flourish. But others, quieter songs sung in the late hours when the guards had gone home, spoke of them differently. These songs told of elves fighting impossible odds, of a dying race making its last stand, of warriors who chose dignity over survival. These songs were dangerous to sing, but they were sung nonetheless, whispered by those humans who still remembered that the elves had once been teachers and friends, and who mourned what humanity had become in conquering them. Chapter 9. The Aen El, the other elves. While the Aen Seidhe struggled and died on the continent, their kin in another world had taken a very different path. The Aen El, the people of the Alders, had settled in a world they called Tir Nalia, and there they had faced challenges that shaped them into something altogether different from their continent-bound relatives. Tir Nalia was a world of stark beauty, dominated by the Aen El, but shared with another race, the unicorns. These were not the gentle creatures of human mythology, but beings of tremendous power and intelligence, possessing their own innate ability to travel between worlds. The unicorns had come from another sphere, displaced by some cosmic catastrophe, and they regarded Tir Nalia as their refuge, their last sanctuary. The arrival of the Aen El had been viewed by the unicorns as an invasion. War was inevitable, a war that lasted for centuries. fought not just with steel and magic, but across multiple dimensions. The unicorns possessed abilities similar to those the elves had once had, the power to step between worlds, to manipulate the fabric of reality. This made them formidable enemies, and the war ground on without clear victor. The long conflict changed the Aen El in profound ways. Where the Aen Seidhe became more peaceful, more focused on art and scholarship, the Aen El became warriors and conquerors. They developed military disciplines and hierarchies unknown to their cousins. They created weapons and armor of terrifying effectiveness, blending magic and metallurgy in ways the Aen Seidhe never had. They became harder, colder, more ruthlessly practical. But the war also prevented the Aen El from suffering the same degree of devolution that afflicted the Aen Seidhe. The constant conflict, the need to maintain their powers to survive, somehow stabilized their connection to the multiverse. They retained more of their original abilities than their continent cousins, could still travel between worlds with relative ease, still wielded magic of tremendous power. They were diminished from what they had once been, certainly, but they remained far more formidable than the fading Aen Seidhe. The Aen El eventually gained the upper hand in their war with the unicorns, driving them to the brink of extinction. They hunted the unicorns not just for victory, but for their abilities, seeking to somehow capture or replicate the unicorns' powers. They enslaved those unicorns they could catch, using them as beasts of burden or forcing them to open portals between worlds. This gave the Aen El access to other spheres, other worlds they could raid and conquer. They became interdimensional raiders, sweeping through various worlds like a plague, taking what they wanted and leaving devastation in their wake. They enslaved other races, bringing them back to Tir na Lia to serve as laborers. They stole resources, artifacts, knowledge, building their civilization on the backs of others. And they developed a reputation in the multiverse that would echo through legend and nightmare. They became known as the Wild Hunt, spectral riders who appeared out of nowhere, brought death and destruction, and vanished before any organized resistance could form. They rode skeletal horses through the sky itself, led by their king, Oberon Muirkatach, and later by his heir, Eredin Breag Gla. They wore armor that seemed forged from darkness and malice, and they took slaves with the same casual cruelty that humans might catch fish. But the Aen El faced a problem their military might could not solve. They were dying out. Their fertility had declined even more severely than that of the Aen Seidhe. Centuries of warfare had killed many of their number, and those losses were not being replaced. Their population was slowly shrinking, and no amount of conquered territory or enslaved laborers could change that fundamental reality. King Oberon and his sages came to the same conclusion their Aen Seidhe cousins had reached. They needed the elder blood. The genetic power that the Aen Seidhe had bred into existence and then lost to human bloodlines was the key to elven survival. With the elder blood, the Aen El might regain their full powers, might reverse their decline, might ensure their race's future. But the elder blood existed on the continent, in another world, in the veins of humans and half-elves. The Aen El had no access to. The conjunction had closed most of the pathways between worlds, and while the Aen El could still travel between spheres, doing so required tremendous energy and careful calculation. They could not simply invade the continent. The logistics were impossible. So they planned, with the patience that comes from living for centuries. They sent scouts to the continent, observers who studied the bloodlines carrying the elder blood, tracking the descendants of Lara Doran through the generations. They learned about the prophecy of Ithlin, about the child of the elder blood who would one day possess the full power of the genetic gift. They realized that this child, this swallow, would be the key to everything. And they waited. They hunted through other worlds, maintaining their strength and resources. They appeared as the wild hunt, spreading terror across multiple spheres, all the while keeping their true purpose hidden. They were waiting for the right moment, for the right person, for the child of the elder blood to manifest so they could claim that power for themselves. The NL had a name for this child they sought, a name that carried both hope and terrible purpose: Cyrilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, descended through unbroken female line from Lara Doran herself. They called her Ziriael, the swallow, and they would stop at nothing to possess her. The relationship between the Aen El and the Aen Seidhe had grown distant over the centuries of separation. They were still kin, still spoke the same language, still shared the same ancient culture. But their experiences had diverged so dramatically that they might as well have been different species. The Aen Seidhe, reduced to refugees and guerrilla fighters, saw the Aen El as what they themselves might have been if circumstances had been different. The Aen El viewed the Aen Seidhe with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing them as weaklings who had allowed themselves to be conquered by short-lived humans. When Eredin Breac Glass, commander of the Wild Hunt and heir to the throne of the Aen El, finally made contact with certain Aen Seidhe factions, he found them desperate enough to accept almost any offer of help. He promised them power, promised them vengeance against the humans, promised them a return to glory. All they had to do was aid him in capturing the child of the elder blood when she finally manifested. Some Aen Seidhe agreed, seeing in the Aen El's strength the salvation they had been seeking. Others refused, recognizing that the Aen El's plans would likely doom the child of the elder blood and any hope she might represent for genuine peace between elves and humans. These divisions created yet another schism among the already fractured Aen Seidhe, elves fighting elves over the fate of a human girl who carried their ancient bloodline. The Aen El did not care about these internal conflicts among their lesser cousins. They had their own agenda, their own desperate need for survival. They would use the Aen Seidhe when convenient and discard them when not. They were predators, and everything else in the multiverse was prey. But for all their power and ruthlessness, the Aen El could not escape one fundamental truth. They were elves, subject to the same cosmic laws that governed their Aen Seidhe cousins. They were fading too, just more slowly. Their civilization, built on conquest and slavery, was fundamentally unsustainable. They needed the elder blood, not just for power, but for survival. And if they could not obtain it, they too would eventually dwindle into extinction. The Wild Hunt rode on, searching through the darkness between worlds, leaving terror in their wake. They were the nightmare that haunted a dozen different worlds, the pale riders who stole people in the night. But they were also a dying race, fighting desperately against an ending they could not prevent, clinging to hope that one human girl might hold the key to their salvation. Chapter 10. Dol Blathana, the last valley. After centuries of retreat and loss, the Aen Seidhe still held one place that remained predominantly Elven, Dol Blathana, the Valley of Flowers. It lay in the foothills of mountains that formed the eastern edge of the continent, a place of such natural beauty that even humans who saw it could not help but be moved. Here the climate was gentle, flowers bloomed year-round, and the ancient forests had not yet fallen to human axes. Dol Blathana had been a sacred place to the elves since their first arrival on the continent. The valley's natural magic was strong, the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds thin. Elven sages had long studied the unique properties of this place, believing it to be a point where multiple dimensions touched, a weak spot in reality's fabric that might one day prove useful. When the human expansion began to truly threaten Elven existence, many Aen Seidhe retreated to Dol Blathana. The valley became a refuge, the last place where elves could live according to their own laws and customs without human interference. The mountains that surrounded it provided natural defenses, and the elves fortified the few passes that led into the valley, making invasion costly for any human army that might attempt it. For a time, humans seemed content to let the elves have this one valley. There was plenty of land elsewhere, and the cost of conquering Dol Blathana would be high. But as human kingdoms consolidated and their populations continued to grow, even this isolated valley became desirable. Temeria and Aedan both laid claim to the territory, and minor skirmishes along the borders became increasingly common. The elves of Dol Blathana lived in a state of constant tension, knowing that human invasion was not a question of if, but when. They prepared as best they could, training warriors, stockpiling weapons, reinforcing their defenses. But they knew in their hearts that no amount of preparation would be sufficient if a major human kingdom truly committed to conquest. This was the situation when Francesca Findabar emerged as a leader among the Aen Seidhe. She was an elf of exceptional beauty and power, a sorceress whose magical abilities rivaled those of the greatest human mages. Humans called her Enid and Gliana, the Daisy of the Valley, a name she accepted with grace even as she worked tirelessly for Elven survival. Francesca understood something many of her people did not. The elves could not win through military might alone. They needed political solutions, alliances, recognition of their right to exist. She reached out to various human factions, offering elven knowledge and magical support in exchange for protection and autonomy. She was, in effect, trying to secure through diplomacy what the elves had lost through warfare. When Nilfgaard's armies invaded the northern kingdoms, Francesca saw an opportunity. The Emperor Emir promised the Scoia'tael not just Dol Blathana, but expanded territory if they fought alongside his forces. Francesca coordinated with the guerrilla fighters, providing intelligence and magical support, hoping that a Nilfgaardian victory would finally secure a homeland for her people. The war was brutal and bloody, with Scoia'tael commandos fighting desperately alongside Nilfgaardian soldiers. They achieved significant victories, proving their worth as allies. And when the war ended, Nilfgaard kept its promise to a degree. Dol Blathana was officially recognized as an Kaiska autonomous region, with Francesca installed as its ruler. The elves finally had legal recognition of their existence, a place they could officially call home. But the reality was more complicated. Francesca ruled only at Nilfgaard's pleasure, subject to the Emperor's oversight. the territory granted was smaller than promised, and many elven communities outside Dol Blathanna remained unprotected. The northern kingdoms, resentful of Scoia'tael collaboration with Nilfgaard, continued to persecute elves within their borders. The dream of a truly independent elven state remained unfulfilled. Still, Dol Blathanna represented something important: survival. Here, at least, elves could speak their own language openly, practice their own customs, raise their children in elven traditions. It was not the glory they had once known, not the golden age of 2,000 years past, but it was something, a toehold on existence, a place where the elven race might endure even as it continued to fade elsewhere. The valley itself seemed to mourn what had been lost. The flowers still bloomed, but they seemed sadder somehow, their colors less vibrant. The forests still stood, but they whispered of emptier times when far more elven voices had sung beneath their boughs. The streams still flowed clear and cold, but they carried memories of blood spilled in defense of this last sanctuary. Francesca ruled with wisdom born of centuries of experience, trying to balance the competing demands of her own people, the Nilfgaardian overlords, and the hostile northern kingdoms that surrounded her valley. She knew that any misstep could result in invasion, that the fragile peace she had negotiated could shatter at any moment. She carried the weight of her entire race's survival on her shoulders, and the burden was almost too much to bear. The elves who lived in Dol Blathanna tried to maintain their culture, to preserve what they could of their heritage. They taught their children the elder speech, recited the old poems, sang the ancient songs. But even here, change was inevitable. The children who had never known anything but this diminished existence could not truly understand what had been lost. The songs sounded hollow when sung by those who had never seen the cities of crystal, who had never known a time when elves ruled and humans were merely rumors from distant lands. And always, there was the question of the future. The elves' fertility continued to decline. Each year saw fewer births, more deaths, the population of even this last stronghold slowly shrinking. Francesca and other leaders desperately sought solutions, encouraging young elves to marry early, providing support for families, even considering the taboo possibility of encouraging unions with humans to introduce genetic diversity. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The elves were dying out, slowly but inexorably. Dol Blathanna might survive for another few centuries, might even persist for 1,000 years. But unless something changed, unless some miracle occurred, the valley would eventually become a tomb, a place where the last of the Aen Seidhe would fade into memory and dust. Yet the elves did not give up hope. They remembered the prophecy of Ithlin, the promise of the child of the elder blood. They did not know what this prophecy truly meant, what this child would do or become, but they clung to it nonetheless, a fragile thread of possibility in the darkness of their decline. Perhaps the swallow, when she came, would bring salvation. Perhaps the elder blood that had been born from Lara Doran's love and sacrifice would somehow reverse the elves' fate. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the prophecy spoke of something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with elven survival. But hope, even desperate and likely false hope, was better than no hope at all. And so, the elves of Dol Blathanna endured, living their diminished lives in their valley of flowers, singing their sad songs, and waiting for a future that might never come. Chapter 11. The Wild Hunt. Riders in the Sky. On certain nights, when the moon was dark and the boundary between worlds grew thin, people across the continent reported seeing them. Spectral riders mounted on skeletal horses, racing across the sky like a storm wind. They appeared without warning, brought terror and abduction, and vanished as mysteriously as they had come. The peasants called them the Wild Hunt, and they whispered prayers of protection whenever clouds gathered in ominous shapes. The truth of the Wild Hunt was both simpler and more complex than the legend suggested. They were not ghosts or demons, though they appeared spectral due to the way they moved between dimensions. They were the Aen Seidhe, the Elven warriors from Tir na Lia, conducting raids into other worlds. The skeletal appearance of their horses was a result of the magical protection that allowed them to survive interdimensional travel. The terror they brought was very real. Eredin Break Glass commanded the Wild Hunt, leading from the front with cold efficiency that had been honed over centuries of warfare. He was the king of the Wild Hunt, though technically he served under Oberon Mursetach, the aging king of the Aen Seidhe. But Oberon was old even by Elven standards, his power fading, and it was Eredin who truly directed the Aen Seidhe's military operations. The Wild Hunt's primary purpose was abduction. They swept through various worlds, identifying individuals with valuable skills, rare magical abilities, or specific bloodlines, and simply took them. These captives were brought back to Tir na Lia and forced into service, whether as laborers, breeding stock, or magical test subjects. It was systematic and ruthless, conducted with the clinical precision that the Aen Seidhe brought to everything they did. But their most important mission was finding the child of the elder blood. The Aen Seidhe's scouts had tracked the Ia bloodline through generations, watching as it spread through human royal families, waiting for the prophesied child who would possess the full power of Aen Seidhe. They knew the child would eventually manifest in the continent, born to the royal house of Sintra, descended through unbroken female line from Lara Dorren herself. When Cyrilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon was born, the Aen Seidhe observed with great interest. Here, potentially, was the swallow, the one they had been seeking for centuries. They watched as she grew, as her latent powers began to manifest, as she became embroiled in the wars and politics of the continent. And they planned how they might capture her, how they might use her power for their own purposes. The Wild Hunt's appearances on the continent became more frequent as Ciri grew older. They were searching for her, tracking her through her use of her elder blood powers. Every time she instinctively opened a portal between worlds, every time she slipped through dimensions, she left traces that the Aen Seidhe could follow. They pursued her relentlessly, appearing again and again, always just missing her as she fled from one danger into another. To the humans of the continent, the Wild Hunt seemed like an incomprehensible horror, a supernatural threat beyond understanding. But to the Aen Seidhe, this was simply survival. They were a dying race, their population declining despite all their conquests and power. The elder blood represented their only hope of reversing this decline, of ensuring their civilization's continuation. They would do whatever was necessary to obtain it. Eredin commanded warriors who had been hardened by centuries of interdimensional warfare. These were not the refined scholars and artists of the Aen Seidhe, but professional soldiers who had known little but combat their entire lives. They wore armor that was both beautiful and terrifying, forged from materials that existed only in Tir na Lia. They wielded weapons enchanted with magic that could strike across dimensions, could kill beings that were not fully present in physical reality. The Wild Hunt traveled using a form of magic that even the most learned human mages could not comprehend. They opened rifts between worlds, creating temporary pathways that allowed them to move from one sphere to another. These rifts were visible as tears in the sky, dark wounds in reality itself that crackled with uncontrolled energy. The sight alone was enough to drive some humans mad, unable to process the implications of what they were seeing. When the Wild Hunt descended on a location, they moved with supernatural speed and coordination. They swept through villages in moments, identifying and taking their targets before any defense could be organized. They fought with a combination of physical prowess and magical ability that few could withstand. Those who resisted were killed without hesitation. The Aen Seidhe had no mercy for those who interfered with their objectives, but for all their power and terror, the Wild Hunt faced limitations. The rifts they created to travel between worlds required tremendous energy to maintain, energy provided by enslaved unicorns they had captured in Tir na Lia. These captive creatures could only create and maintain portals for limited periods before requiring rest. This meant the Wild Hunt's incursions were necessarily brief, raids rather than sustained invasions. Additionally, the Aen Seidhe had learned through painful experience that extended periods in other worlds weakened them. The dimensional environment of Tir na Lia sustained them in ways other worlds did not, and prolonged absence from their home sphere caused their powers to fade, their physical forms to destabilize. They could raid but could not conquer, could terrorize but could not occupy. This fundamental limitation shaped their strategy. They needed to find Ciri, capture her quickly, and return to Tir na Lia before their power waned. But Ciri proved frustratingly difficult to catch. She was constantly moving, protected by various allies, and her own nascent elder blood powers allowed her to escape even when capture seemed certain. The hunt stretched from months into years, with the Aen Seidhe growing increasingly desperate. Eredin's personal investment in the hunt went beyond mere duty. He had killed his own king, Oberon, when the old elf had attempted to father a child with Ciri through more diplomatic means. Eredin wanted the elder blood power itself, not some future half-elven offspring. He believed that if he could capture Ciri, force her to cooperate, he could use her abilities to permanently stabilize the pathways between worlds, giving the Aen Seidhe unlimited access to every sphere of existence. The stories told about the Wild Hunt on the continent were a mixture of truth and fabrication. Yes, they abducted people, but not randomly or for sport. Yes, they brought death, but usually only to those who actively resisted. Yes, they were terrifying, but they were not incomprehensible demons. They were elves, driven by the same desperate need for survival that motivated the Scoia'tael guerrillas hiding in the continent's forests. In a strange way, the Aen Seidhe and the Aen Seidhe were mirror images of one another. Both were elves facing extinction. The Aen Seidhe had become victims, conquered and marginalized, surviving through accommodation and desperate guerrilla warfare. The Aen Seidhe had become predators, surviving through conquest and exploitation. But both were dying. Both were grasping at the same hope, the child of the elder blood who might somehow save them. The wild hunt rode on, hunting through the darkness between worlds, appearing in nightmares across a dozen different spheres. They were the last great military force of elven kind, powerful beyond measure, yet ultimately doomed unless they could capture the one person who could save them. And so they searched and killed and abducted and inspired terror, all in service of a survival that grew more uncertain with each passing year. Chapter 12, The Ruins. What remains? Across the continent, scattered like broken jewels, lie the ruins of elven civilization. Human cities have been built atop them, human farms carved from their gardens, human roads paved over their pathways. But still they persist, these remnants of a glory that once was, whispering to those who know how to listen. In the forests of Brokilon, ancient elven structures stand half reclaimed by nature, trees growing through what were once great halls. The dryads who now rule this deep forest are not elves, but they maintain and protect these ruins with reverent care, understanding that they are custodians of something precious. The elven architecture, even in its decay, possesses a beauty that human craft cannot match. The curves of the remaining walls seem to flow like water. The surviving columns rise like trees. The whole design speaks of beings who understood that buildings should be part of nature, not separate from it. In the city of Oxenford, beneath the university's oldest buildings, lie the foundations of an elven academy that stood for 1,000 years before humans ever reached these shores. Students walking to their classes pass unknowing over chambers where elven sages once taught magic to pupils who had centuries to perfect their art. Occasionally, workers digging new foundations uncover elven artifacts, beautifully crafted items whose purpose has been forgotten. These finds are collected by the university's museum, where they are studied by human scholars who can only guess at their original significance. Loch Muina, once a center of elven magical learning, stands as an abandoned ruin in a remote part of the continent. The human kings who destroyed it found the place too strange, too unsettling to occupy. The towers still stand, though damaged, and the courtyards remain, though overgrown. Here one can still feel the residual magic that once saturated this place, can sense the echo of spells cast centuries ago. It is a haunted place, haunted by memory and loss. The ruins of Shaerrawedd in the far north have become a destination for adventurers and treasure hunters, foolish humans seeking elven gold and artifacts. Most find only death in the frozen passages, killed by ancient traps or the creatures that have made the ruins their lair. But some few, those who approach with respect rather than greed, report experiencing something profound in those abandoned halls. They speak of hearing music with no source, of seeing figures from the corner of their eyes that vanish when directly observed, of feeling a sadness so deep it brings them to tears. Scattered throughout Skellige, on the remote islands of that archipelago, stand elven structures that predate human settlement by millennia. The islanders regard these ruins with superstitious fear, believing them to be cursed or haunted. They are not entirely wrong. The Ka elves built many of their structures on places of power, points where the natural magic of the world flows strongly. These locations remain charged with that power, dangerous to those who do not understand what they are dealing with. In the mountains between Temeria and Aedan, there is a valley that appears on no map. Travelers who stumble into it report finding an entire elven city preserved in impossible condition, looking as though its inhabitants simply walked away yesterday. The buildings stand complete. The gardens still bloom with flowers that have no names in human tongues. Fountains flow with water that never runs dry. Those who enter this valley speak of feeling watched, of hearing whispers in a language they almost but not quite understand. Most leave quickly, disturbed by the wrongness of the place. A few never leave at all, vanishing without trace. Human mages and scholars who study these ruins have developed theories about elven construction and magic. They note that elven architecture incorporates mathematical principles that humans have only recently begun to understand, that the proportions and angles seem to follow rules more suited to four-dimensional space than three-dimensional reality. Some theorize that elven buildings were designed to exist partially in other dimensions, that what appears to be purely decorative elements actually served important magical or structural functions that human observers simply cannot perceive. The artifacts recovered from these ruins are prized by collectors and scholars alike. Elven swords that never lose their edge, forged through techniques no human smith has been able to replicate. Mirrors that show not reflections, but glimpses of other times and places. Books written in the Elder speech, containing knowledge of magic and nature that humanity has not yet rediscovered. Musical instruments that play themselves when the moon is full, filling the night with melodies of heartbreaking beauty. But the most common finds are the simplest: pottery and jewelry, everyday items that speak to the lives the elves once lived. A ceramic bowl decorated with intricate patterns, created by an artisan whose name is lost to time. A necklace of silver and moonstone, worn by an elf who died centuries ago. These humble artifacts often prove more moving than the grandest treasures, for they remind us that the elves were not just powerful beings of legend, but people who lived and loved and created beauty even in ordinary things. The ruins have become pilgrimage sites for the surviving Aen Seidhe. Groups of elves journey in secret to these places, conducting ceremonies and rituals meant to honor their ancestors and preserve the memory of what was lost. They sing the old songs in the abandoned halls, speak prayers in the elder speech, leave offerings of flowers and food for spirits that may or may not still linger. These pilgrimages are dangerous. Humans who encounter them often attack on sight, seeing only non-humans trespassing on human land. Some humans, however, have come to appreciate the ruins for what they represent. Certain scholars and artists visit these places seeking inspiration, drawn by the beauty of elven craft and the melancholy romance of a fallen civilization. They write poems about the ruins, compose symphonies inspired by their architecture, paint scenes of abandoned elven cities bathed in moonlight. This artistic response to elven ruins has begun slowly to change some human attitudes, fostering a grudging respect for what the elves achieved. But for most humans, the ruins are simply obstacles to be removed or resources to be plundered. Elven stonework is broken up and used to build human structures. Elven orchards are cut down to make room for human farms. Elven graves are robbed for their treasures. The systematic destruction continues year by year, century by century, erasing the physical evidence of elven civilization from the continent. Yet the ruins persist. They are more resilient than they appear, built with magic as well as stone, constructed to last for ages that humans cannot comprehend. Long after the last elf has vanished from the world, after the elder speech has been completely forgotten, after even the memory of what the Aen Seidhe were has faded into myth, these ruins will likely remain, silent testimony to a people who came from beyond the stars, who built wonders, who lived and loved, and ultimately were destroyed by those they tried to help. And sometimes, on certain nights, when conditions are right, the ruins come alive again. Travelers report seeing lights moving through abandoned halls, hearing laughter and music echoing from empty rooms. They see ghostly figures dancing in overgrown gardens, elves dressed in finery that has not been worn for centuries, celebrating festivals that no living being remembers. Whether these are true spirits or merely echoes, impressions left in places saturated with memory and magic, no one can say. What is certain is that the ruins of Elven civilization carry weight beyond their physical presence. They are monuments to impermanence, reminders that even the mightiest civilizations eventually fall. They speak of beauty and loss, of glory and tragedy, of the terrible price paid when one people conquers another. They stand as warnings and as inspiration, as graves and as hopes, fragments of a past that can never be reclaimed but should never be forgotten. Chapter 13, The Prophecy, Ithlin's Vision. In the darkness of Elven decline, in the centuries when hope seemed a cruel luxury, there emerged a prophecy that would shape the fate of nations and the course of history itself. Ithlin Aeb Evenian was young by Elven standards, barely into her second century, when the vision came to her. She was an Aen Seidhe, a knowing one, trained in the deepest mysteries of Elven magic, but nothing had prepared her for what she would see. The vision struck her during a ritual meant to commune with the flow of time itself. Suddenly, she was no longer in her body, no longer in a single moment, but adrift in a sea of possibilities and destinies. She saw threads of fate weaving together, forming patterns of such complexity that to fully comprehend them would require a consciousness beyond even Elven capacity. And at the center of these threads, she saw a figure, a girl, pale-haired, bearing the mark of the elder blood in every fiber of her being. A child born of love and loss, descended from Lara Doran through unbroken female line. The girl possessed power beyond measure, the ability to open gates between worlds, to step outside the normal flow of time, to reshape reality through will alone. She would be called Ziriel, the Swallow, and she would come in a time of ice and darkness, when the world stood on the edge of annihilation. But the vision was not clear, not simple. Ithlin saw multiple futures branching from this girl's choices. In some timelines, the child of the elder blood saved the world, sacrificing herself to prevent a catastrophe of cosmic proportions. In others, she became the instrument of destruction, her power twisted to serve ends that would unmake reality itself. The girl was simultaneously savior and destroyer, hope and doom, and which she would become depended on choices not yet made, on events that had not yet unfolded. Ithlin saw that the child of the elder blood would be hunted. The Aen El would seek her, wanting to use her power to ensure their own survival. Humans would fear her, seeing in her abilities a threat to their dominance. Even her own people, the Aen Seidhe, would be divided over what she represented. She would know little peace, little rest, pursued across worlds and through time by those who wanted to control her, use her, destroy her. The vision showed Ithlin that the prophecy would unfold over centuries. The elder blood would be tested, refined, concentrated through generations of Lara Doran's descendants. The bloodline would spread through human royal houses, carried by queens and princesses who had no idea what power slept in their veins. It would manifest in small ways at first, minor abilities and strange dreams, gradually building toward its full expression in the child of the elder blood. And surrounding this central vision, Ithlin saw a multitude of other events, a cascade of consequences that would flow from the appearance of the swallow. She saw a white frost descending upon the world, an ice age of unnatural origin that would threaten all life. She saw great armies marching, kingdoms rising and falling, ancient evils awakening from their slumber. She saw love and betrayal, sacrifice and redemption, all the complex interplay of human and non-human destiny. The vision spoke to Ithlin in fragments, in poetic images that she would struggle for weeks to translate into coherent language. When she finally emerged from her trance, days had passed, and her fellow sages found her collapsed and barely breathing. They nursed her back to health while she frantically recorded everything she had seen, trying to capture the essence of the prophecy before the details faded from memory. The prophecy, when Ithlin finally articulated it, was both specific and maddeningly vague. The child of the elder blood will come in a time of contempt, born under the sign of the black sun. She will have the power to destroy the world or to save it. Verily I say unto you, the era of the sword and axe is nigh, the era of the wolf's blizzard. The time of the white frost and the white light is nigh, the time of madness and the time of contempt. Ted Dariad, the time of end. The world will die amidst frost and be reborn with the new sun. It will be reborn of the elder blood, of Hen Iker, of the seed that has been sown, a seed which will not sprout but burst into flame. The Elven sages debated the prophecy's meaning for decades. What was the white frost that Ithlin had seen? Some believed it was literal, an ice age that would cover the world. Others thought it metaphorical, representing a death of culture and civilization. What did it mean that the child of the elder blood could destroy or save the world? How could one individual carry such weight of destiny? The prophecy gave the Aen Seidhe something they desperately needed: purpose. Here was confirmation that their careful breeding project, their creation of the elder blood, would not be in vain. The gift they had engineered and then lost to human bloodlines would eventually manifest in full, and when it did, it would matter. The fate of the world would turn on it. But the prophecy also filled them with dread. They had created something powerful, perhaps too powerful. The elder blood was their greatest achievement and potentially their most terrible mistake. If the child of the elder blood chose destruction, if she used her powers for evil or simply made the wrong decisions at crucial moments, she could unmake everything. The elves would be responsible for the end of the world, their legacy one of ultimate catastrophe rather than salvation. The Aen El, when they learned of the prophecy through their spies among the Aen Seidhe, saw in it confirmation of their own plans. The child of the elder blood would have the power to open gates between worlds, exactly what they needed. They began planning how to capture her, how to bend her to their will, how to force her cooperation. They did not care about salvation or destruction of the world. They cared only about their own survival. Human mages who learned fragments of the prophecy dismissed it as Elven superstition. Humans put little stock in prophecy, preferring to believe they controlled their own destinies. But some few, those who had studied Elven magic deeply, recognized that Ithlin had been no ordinary seer. The Aen Seidhe possessed abilities that human diviners could not match, could perceive patterns in time that were invisible to lesser sight. If Ithlin had seen a child of the elder blood, then such a child would almost certainly appear. The prophecy became intertwined with other predictions and portents. The legend of the Black Sun, which foretold that girls born under certain eclipses would bring calamity, became connected to the prophecy. Human kings ordered such girls killed, fearing they might be the destroyer Ithlin had foreseen. They could not know that the child of the elder blood would be born under different stars, that their slaughter of innocent children served no purpose except to add more tragedy to an already dark world. As centuries passed and the prophesied child did not appear, some began to doubt. Perhaps Ithlin had been mistaken or mad, or had seen possibilities that would never become realities. Perhaps the elder blood had been diluted too much in human veins, would never achieve the full expression the prophecy required. Perhaps it had all been wishful thinking, desperate elves creating a myth of future salvation to comfort themselves in their decline. But the prophecy persisted, passed down through generations of elves, recorded in hidden archives, whispered around Scoia'tael campfires. It became part of Elven cultural identity, a shared hope that unified them even as they were scattered across the continent. The child of the elder blood would come, they told one another. The swallow would appear, and things would change. They had to believe it, because without that belief, what did they have? Only extinction and the slow fade into oblivion. And unknown to most, the prophecy was slowly, inexorably coming to pass. Through the royal house of Sintra, through the line of queens who ruled that coastal kingdom, the elder blood was being concentrated. Generation by generation, the power was building, approaching the threshold where it would finally manifest in full. The child of the elder blood was coming, born not in some distant future, but in the lifetime of elves who still lived, who still remembered the prophecy's first speaking. Her name would be Cyrilla. She would be called Ciri by those who loved her. The Aen El would hunt her as Ziriel, the swallow, and she would indeed have the power to save or destroy the world, just as Ithlin had foreseen. The prophecy was not metaphor or wishful thinking, but terrible truth, and its fulfillment would shake the foundations of reality itself. Chapter 14, Ardgaith, the Second Conjunction. 1,500 years after the conjunction of the spheres had changed the world forever, the Aen Seidhe, who still studied the fabric of reality, began to notice disturbing signs. The boundaries between worlds were growing unstable again, not catastrophically as during the first conjunction, but showing increasing volatility. Portals that had been sealed since the conjunction were spontaneously opening and closing. Creatures from other dimensions were appearing with increasing frequency. The sages recognized these signs. The multiverse was preparing for another conjunction. This second event would be different from the first. It would not be a chaotic collision of dozens of worlds, but rather a more focused phenomenon. The continent's reality was beginning to merge with one specific other dimension, a process that would either create a stable connection between the two, or catastrophically destroy both. The elves, with their greater understanding of multidimensional mechanics, grasped the implications faster than humans did. The site where this merger would be strongest was identified, a place called Ard Gaith, the Winter Gate, located on the northernmost reaches of the continent. Here the boundaries between dimensions were naturally thin, and here the two realities would touch most directly. The area would become a focal point for interdimensional energy, a place of tremendous danger and equally tremendous opportunity. The elves saw in this second conjunction something different from what humans saw. For humans, it represented merely a curiosity, a strange magical event to be studied and perhaps exploited. But for elves, it represented an opportunity that might never come again. If the right conditions could be created during the conjunction, if the proper rituals were performed, portals could be opened that would remain stable. Gates to other worlds could be established, and most importantly, passage could be secured to realms where Elven civilization still flourished. In Tir na Lia, the Aen El observed the same phenomenon from their side. They saw that the second conjunction would create a bridge between their world and the continent, a permanent pathway if properly stabilized. This bridge could solve many of their problems, could allow them to raid the continent at will, could give them access to the Elder Blood without the tremendous energy expenditure required by their current methods. Both groups of elves, Aen Seidhe and Aen El, realized that the second conjunction represented a potential escape route for the declining Aen Seidhe. If stable portals could be established, the remaining elves on the continent could flee to other worlds, could find places where they would not be persecuted and hunted. They could leave behind the humans who had conquered them, could abandon a continent that had become a graveyard for their civilization. Francesca Findebear and other Aen Seidhe leaders began secret preparations. They gathered their people, stockpiled supplies, identified those who would attempt the crossing when the time came. They did not share these plans with humans, seeing no reason to warn the very people who had driven them to this desperate measure. Let the humans inherit the continent entirely. The elves would find new homes in the infinite spheres of the multiverse. But the second conjunction also drew the attention of darker forces. The Wild Hunt intensified their activities, knowing that this event could give them unrestricted access to the continent and the child of the Elder Blood. Various monsters and interdimensional predators began gathering, drawn by the thinning barriers between worlds, and certain human mages, recognizing the potential power that could be harnessed from the conjunction, made their own preparations to exploit it. The event, when it finally occurred, was spectacular and terrifying. The sky above Ardgaith tore open, revealing glimpses of other worlds. Portals began manifesting spontaneously across the region, creatures pouring through from dimensions unknown. The temperature dropped precipitously, frost spreading for miles in all directions as the white frost that Ithlin had prophesied began to manifest. The Aen Seidhe gathered at designated points, ready to flee through the portals when they stabilized. Families that had lived on the continent for 2,000 years, prepared to abandon the only home they had ever known. They looked one last time upon the forests and valleys where their ancestors had built and lived and died, and they prepared to say goodbye forever. But the second conjunction required something the elves had not anticipated: a catalyst, someone with the power to stabilize the portals and control the flow of dimensional energy. It required the child of the elder blood, the very person the NL had been hunting, the girl around whom Ithlin's prophecy revolved. Without her, the portals would remain chaotic and unstable, unsuitable for mass migration. With her, stable gates could be opened that would allow safe passage to other worlds. And so all eyes turned to Cyrilla, the heir of Sintra, the girl who carried in her veins the accumulated power of countless generations. She had fled across the continent and through multiple dimensions, pursued by the Wild Hunt, by human armies, by everyone who wanted to use her power. And now, she stood at the Winter Gate, at the focal point of the second conjunction, the only person with the ability to control what was happening. The choice she faced was impossible. If she used her power to stabilize the portals, the Aen Seidhe could escape, could find new homes where they might survive and even flourish. But stabilizing the portals would also give the Wild Hunt permanent access to the continent, would allow Eredin and his warriors to raid at will. And there was no guarantee that the portals would only connect to safe, hospitable worlds. They might open onto dimensions of horror, might unleash things into the continent that would make the monsters of the first conjunction look like harmless animals. Alternatively, she could attempt to close all the portals, to seal the dimensional rifts and prevent the second conjunction from completing. This would trap the Aen Seidhe on the continent, would deny them their chance at escape, but it would also prevent the Wild Hunt from establishing their permanent bridge, would stop the White Frost from spreading, would protect the continent from interdimensional invasion. The weight of this decision would have crushed most people, but Ciri, trained as a witcher, hardened by her flight across worlds, guided by those who loved her and believed in her, made her choice. The details of what exactly transpired at Ardgaith remain uncertain, events too complex and multidimensional to be easily recorded. But when the dust settled and the dimensional storms quieted, certain outcomes were clear. Some portals remained open, stable connections to other worlds that could be used for controlled travel. The Aen Seidhe, who wished to leave the continent, had that option available to them. But these portals were limited in number and carefully controlled, not the wholesale interdimensional bridges that the Wild Hunt had sought. Eredin and his forces were dealt a defeat, though not a final one. The Wild Hunt would continue to exist, would continue to hunt, but their power to threaten the continent was significantly diminished. The White Frost, that cosmic winter Ithlin had foreseen, was halted, or at least delayed. The temperature began to rise again. The unnatural ice began to melt. Whatever catastrophe the White Frost represented had been averted, or perhaps merely postponed to some future time when new heroes would have to face it. In the aftermath of the second conjunction, a great exodus began. Thousands of Aen Seidhe, perhaps half the remaining population on the continent, chose to leave. They passed through the portals in family groups and entire communities, carrying what they could, abandoning what they could not. They were not running away, they told themselves, but rather returning to their destiny as travelers between worlds. They were going home, or at least going to find new homes. Francesca Findabair led many of them, using her considerable power to ensure safe passage. She looked back once upon Dol Blathana, the valley she had ruled, and then stepped through the portal without hesitation. Other worlds waited, worlds where elves might be masters again rather than subjects or refugees. The time of the Aen Seidhe on the continent was ending, not with a bang, but with a deliberate choice to depart. But not all elves left. Some chose to remain, for reasons as varied as the individuals themselves. Some had human friends or family they could not abandon. Some felt the continent was their home, regardless of how humans had treated them. Some were simply too old or too tired to face another migration, preferring to live out their remaining years in places they knew. And some remained because they still believed in the possibility of coexistence, still hoped that elves and humans might one day truly live in peace. Those who remained were a changed people. The Exodus had been a purging of sorts, taking with it many of the most bitter, the most wounded, the most angry elves. Those who stayed tended to be those who had found ways to adapt, to survive, to carve out lives in the shadow of human dominance. They would continue to speak elder speech in their homes, would continue to teach their children Elven history, would continue to remember what had been, but they would also build new lives, new relationships with humans who respected them, new ways of being Elven in a human-dominated world. The second conjunction, like the first, fundamentally altered the continent. The world now had stable connections to other dimensions, a fact that would influence politics and magic for generations to come. The very fact that it was possible to leave, that other worlds existed and could be reached, changed how people thought about their place in the universe. The continent was no longer isolated, but connected to a wider multiverse, with all the opportunities and dangers that implied. For the elves, the second conjunction represented both an ending and a beginning. An ending of their presence on the continent, as a significant population, as a people who might still claim their ancestral territories, but also a beginning, a return to their original nature as travelers between worlds, as beings who belong to the multiverse rather than any single sphere of existence. They had come to the continent in silver ships from dying worlds. Now they were leaving again, seeking new homes in the infinite expanse of possible realities. And in the places they left behind, in the ruins and forests where Elven songs had once filled the air, there was silence. Not the silence of death exactly, but the silence of absence, of departure. The wind still whispered through ancient trees, still carried echoes of voices long gone. The streams still flowed through overgrown gardens, still reflected moonlight on flowers that bloomed for no one. The stones of ruined palaces still stood, still bore witness to glories that had passed. The age of the Aen Seidhe on the continent was over, not completely ended, for some remained, but fundamentally concluded. They had come, they had built wonders, they had taught humanity magic and art and philosophy, and humanity had conquered them, driven them to near extinction, taken everything they had created. It was a tragedy that would echo through history, a crime that could never be undone. But perhaps in other worlds, on other continents yet to be discovered, the story would be different. Perhaps there the elves would find peoples who valued knowledge over conquest, who chose cooperation over domination. Perhaps there they could build their civilization anew, could create beauty without fearing its destruction. Perhaps there they could finally find peace. The portals at Ard Gaith remained open, doorways to possibility and hope. And through those doorways, the elves walked, leaving behind their past and stepping into an unknown future, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of their long existence on the continent. They walked between the worlds as they had always been meant to do, as they had done before humanity existed, and would perhaps do long after humanity had vanished into history's dust. Chapter 15. Echoes in Silence. The last songs. Now, in the twilight of elven presence on the continent, in the quiet years after the great exodus, we come to what remains. In Dol Blethana, a reduced population tends to the valley that has been their last refuge. They maintain the gardens, sing the old songs, teach their children the elder speech and the history of their people. They remember because memory is all they have left of glory. In the deep forests where Scoia'tael once fought, a few commandos remain, old elves now, scarred by centuries of warfare. They no longer ambush human caravans. The fight has gone out of them. They simply live in the woods they have defended, watching the seasons turn, waiting for the end that comes for all things. Sometimes young elves visit them, seeking stories of the resistance, wanting to know how their people fought before the Exodus. The old warriors tell their tales, and sometimes their voices crack with emotion, remembering comrades who fell, battles that meant everything and nothing. In human cities, in the ghettos and poor quarters, elves survive as they have always survived, by adapting, by keeping their heads down, by doing whatever work humans will allow them. They hide their elven heritage when they can, but their features give them away, mark them as other. Their children grow up speaking common speech as their first language, learning elder speech only in secret, if at all. These city elves have forgotten much, but they remember enough to know what they have lost. The ruins scattered across the continent continue to decay, year by year, stone by stone. Human kingdoms have laws now about preserving historical sites, but these laws are rarely enforced when the sites are elven. The destruction continues, slower than before, but no less inexorable. In another few centuries, there may be nothing left but rubble, fragments too scattered to even hint at what once stood there. But in the preserved corners, in the places humans have not yet reached or have chosen to leave untouched, something persists. The magic woven into elven construction does not fade entirely. On certain nights, under certain conditions, the ruins still glow with ghostly light. Songs still echo from empty halls. Figures still dance in overgrown courtyards, celebrating festivals from ages past. Whether these are true spirits or merely recordings, impressions left in places saturated with memory, no one living can say with certainty. The human scholars who study elven history grow old and die, their knowledge passed to new generations who care less, who have never seen a living elven city, who cannot imagine what the world was like when the Aen Seidhe ruled. The books they have written gather dust in library archives. The artifacts they have collected sit behind glass in museums. Curiosities from a dead civilization that has no living representatives to give them context. But memory persists, carried in unexpected ways. The human mages who learned magic from elven teachers pass that knowledge to their apprentices. And though the magical traditions have been adapted and changed, they still carry traces of their elven origins. The elder speech words embedded in common speech remain, small monuments to a lost culture. The artistic movements inspired by elven aesthetics continue, creating new beauty even as they mourn the old. And in the minds and hearts of the few elves who remain on the continent, the entirety of their people's history lives on. They carry within them the knowledge of what their race once was, what they built, what they achieved. They remember the silver ships that brought their ancestors to these shores. They remember the golden age when elves were masters of all they surveyed. They remember the long decline, the wars, the betrayals, the slow extinction of everything they held dear. These remaining elves are living archives, repositories of cultural memory that will vanish when they die, unless they find ways to pass on their knowledge, to preserve in some permanent form the essence of what it meant to be Aen Seidhe. That knowledge will be lost forever. Some attempt this preservation through writing, composing histories and memoirs in elder speech that they hide away in secret places, hoping that future generations might find and value them. Others teach their children and grandchildren, conducting lessons in secret rooms, keeping alive the oral traditions that have sustained their people through dark times. The prophecy of Ithlin takes on new meaning in these final days. The child of the elder blood came, made her choices, shaped the destiny of the world. She saved the continent from the white frost, provided an escape route for those who wished to leave. But she did not restore Elven civilization, did not reverse the long decline, did not usher in a new golden age. The prophecy promised salvation or destruction, and perhaps what the world received was neither or both or something in between. Ciri herself, that child of the elder blood, lives on somewhere in the multiverse, walking between worlds as her ancestors once did. She carries in her veins the blood of Laradoran, the culmination of the Aen Seidhe's greatest project. She is, in a sense, the last true elf, possessing powers that even the ancient En Undod would have envied. But she is also human, raised in human society, shaped by human values. She is the bridge between the races that Lara sought to create through love, achieved through genetic design and prophecy and cosmic chance. The elves who know of her regard Ciri with complicated emotions. She represents both their greatest success and their ultimate failure. They created the elder blood to save their race, and it produced a being of unimaginable power. But that being chose to help humanity as much as Elvenkind chose to preserve the world rather than restore Elven dominion over it. She is not the savior they wanted, but perhaps she is the savior they needed, even if they cannot see it. In the songs that elves still sing, in the stories they tell their children, certain themes repeat. They sing of beauty lost, of wonders destroyed, of a people brought low by those they tried to help. They sing of the injustice of it all, the cruelty of fate that gave them such long lives only to fill those lives with endless grief. They sing of longing for worlds beyond this one, for homes they have never seen but somehow remember in their blood. But they also sing of resilience, of survival against impossible odds. They sing of love that transcends racial boundaries, of friendships between elf and human that prove deeper than centuries of hatred. They sing of the few humans who helped them, who stood against their own kind to protect elven refugees, who valued justice over tribal loyalty. These songs are quieter, less popular than the songs of rage and loss, but they exist nonetheless, testaments to the possibility of reconciliation. The final elven generation on the continent grows old, knowing they will likely be the last. They have seen the exodus, watched their friends and family depart through portals to other worlds. They have chosen to remain for whatever reasons, and they will live out their days in a land that has become alien to them. When they die, the elven presence on the continent will be reduced to memories and ruins, to half-elven descendants who retain a fraction of their heritage, to historical footnotes in human chronicles. But they are not bitter, these Lost Elves, or at least not only bitter. They have had long lives to process their grief, to come to terms with their people's fate. They have learned, as all elves eventually learn, that everything passes, everything ends, that even the longest-lived beings must eventually face the darkness. They will face it with dignity, with grace, with the understanding that they are the last notes of a song that has been playing for 3,000 years, and perhaps in distant worlds reached through the portals of Ardgaith, the song continues. Perhaps there the Aen Seidhe have found new homes, built new cities, begun the long process of cultural renewal. Perhaps Francesca Finderbear rules over a reborn elven kingdom, her people finally free from human persecution. Perhaps the children born in those new worlds will grow up strong and numerous, will reclaim the powers their ancestors lost, will become again what the elves once were. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the elves who fled the continent simply found new places to slowly die out, new forests to haunt, as sad ghosts of former glory. Perhaps their fertility continues to decline, their powers continue to fade, their numbers continue to dwindle no matter what world they inhabit. Perhaps the devolution that began with the first conjunction cannot be reversed, and the elves everywhere are simply fading, a race whose time has passed. No one on the continent knows for certain. The portals remain, but few dare to use them, and those who do rarely return. The worlds beyond are mysteries, possibly wondrous, possibly terrible. The elves who left are gone, as thoroughly as if they had died, and whether they have found salvation or merely different forms of suffering, the continent will likely never know. And so, the story of the Aen Seidhe on the continent comes to its close, not with thunder and flame, but with whispers and fading echoes. Their cities crumble, their language dies, their very memory grows dim in human minds, becoming mythology, becoming legend, becoming forgotten. They are the people who came from beyond the stars, who built wonders beyond human imagination, who taught humanity magic and art and philosophy, and who were destroyed by their students. It is a tragedy, but perhaps it is also a natural cycle. Civilizations rise and fall, races come and go. What seems eternal reveals itself as temporary. The elves had their time, and it was glorious, and it ended, as all things must end. And perhaps that is the final lesson they can teach, that nothing lasts forever, that beauty is precious precisely because it is fragile, that we must cherish what we have while we have it, because time takes all things, even the immortal. And so the last song of the Aen Seidhe fades into the wind, carried away on currents of air that flow between worlds, dispersing into silence and stars. The forests grow quiet where once they rang with elven voices. The ruins stand empty under empty skies. The memories dim and fade and finally expire, leaving only stones and dust and the eternal question: what was lost when the elves fell, and can it ever be recovered? Perhaps somewhere in the deep places of the world, in hidden valleys or ancient caves, a single elf remains, the very last of their kind on the continent. Perhaps they sit beneath a tree their ancestors planted 2,000 years ago. watching the sun set over lands that were once theirs. Perhaps they sing one final song in elder speech, a lullaby or a war chant, a love poem or a dirge. Perhaps they close their eyes and remember everything: the silver ships and the golden age, the glory and the fall, the long, long twilight of their race. And then, perhaps, they too pass, quietly, peacefully, their last breath carrying away the final whisper of 3,000 years of elven civilization on the continent. And the stars watch on, as they always have, eternal and cold and indifferent, bearing witness to the rise and fall of peoples beyond counting, remembering everything and nothing, shining their ancient light on a world that continues, always continues, regardless of who lives upon it. Yet somewhere, beneath ancient boughs that remember when the world was young, a single note still lingers. Not a song, not anymore, but the ghost of a song, the memory of music that once filled these forests with beauty and joy. It drifts on the wind, barely audible, almost below hearing. But it persists, that single note, quiet, eternal, and still. And perhaps, if you listen very carefully, if you come to these places at the right time and in the right state of mind, you can hear it. The last echo of the Aen Seidhe, the last whisper of the people who came from beyond the stars. Listen, can you hear it? That soft sound, like silver bells or distant water. That gentle music that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. That is the sound of elven civilization fading, of a people passing into memory and legend, of a song that will never be sung again, but will never be completely silenced. Listen and remember, for we are all that remains now, all that stands between the elves and complete oblivion. In our memory, in our stories, in our preservation of what fragments of their culture survive, the Aen Seidhe persist, not as they were, glorious and powerful, but as echoes, as ghosts, as dreams we had once and almost remember. The stars watch on, the forests grow quiet, the ruins crumble into dust, and the last song of the elves fades, fades, fades into silence eternal. And so we close this journey through the lost history of the Aen Seidhe, the people of the hills, the elves who came from beyond the stars and dwelt among us for a brief time, cosmically speaking. We have walked through their golden age and their long decline, through their triumphs and their tragedies. We have heard their songs and seen their ruins. We have witnessed the slow extinction of a people who once seemed immortal. If this tale has moved you, if you found beauty in these stories of loss and longing, then please like and subscribe. Share these tales with others who might appreciate them. For in the sharing of stories, in the preservation of memory, something of what was lost can be kept alive. The elves may be gone from the continent, but their story remains, a testament to the fragility of civilization and the endurance of beauty, even in the face of ultimate defeat. Until next time, fellow travelers, may your dreams be filled with starlight and ancient songs. May you walk in forests that remember when the world was young. May you hear in the wind the echoes of voices long silenced. And may you carry with you always the knowledge that beauty, once created, can never be entirely destroyed, but lives on in memory and story, eternal as the stars themselves. Good night, and may your rest be gentle.